Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're trying something new. It's a rapid-fire deep dive into the biggest environmental news stories impacting you right now. We've got a lot to get through, but we'll make it fun and useful.
Yeah, I've been seeing some pretty alarming trends, honestly. It's kind of like we're watching a perfect storm brewing on the environmental front.
Oh, that doesn't sound good. Let's start with the political earthquake shaking up the environmental landscape. Trump's back,
Mhm.
and his administration is wasting no time rolling back those environmental protections. They're freezing funding for clean energy and weakening regulations on pollution.
It really does feel like a repeat of his first term, but the stakes are so much higher now. The climate crisis is just accelerating. The EPA's Environmental Justice Office, that's the one focused on protecting communities burdened by pollution. Well, it's basically been shut down.
Shut down. Correct.
Yeah, the Washington Post and a few other sources are saying staff have been put on leave, so that means less protection for the people who need it most.
And speaking of funding freezes, it's not just happening in the U.S. The Washington Post also reported that USAID climate programs have been halted.
Right, which could affect disaster preparedness in almost 100 countries.
Wow. So these funding decisions, they really have ripple effects that go way beyond our borders.
Oh, absolutely. It puts a lot of projects at risk. Projects aimed at building climate resilience in some of the most vulnerable places in the world.
It's like we can't catch a break on anything.
Yeah.
And while the government is pulling back, some corporations seem to be taking advantage. Grist reported that ExxonMobil is looking for tax breaks for a huge new plastics plant in Texas. And people there are already dealing with pollution from similar facilities.
It really makes you question who benefits from these types of projects and who ends up stuck with the environmental burden. It feels like a classic case of corporate interests versus community well-being.
Definitely. And on top of everything else, January was the hottest on record globally, even with La Niña's cooling effect.
The conversation and UN News both confirmed it. It's a symptom of this larger climate crisis. Scientists are even saying that a key Atlantic Ocean current could collapse by 2050.
Collapse.
Yeah, because of ice melt. Inside Climate News had the story. It would have a devastating impact on weather patterns. We could see a lot more extreme events, and it could disrupt global food systems.
And these global trends, they're hitting close to home, too. The LA Times reported on mysterious land purchases within Joshua Tree National Park.
Which is concerning, right? It raises questions about conservation and balancing preserving these spaces with economic interests. It's a local issue, but it could have national implications for the future of the places we love.
And speaking of local impacts, Hot House is urging Los Angeles to learn from the post-wildfire housing crisis in Maui and take steps to prevent something similar here.
It's a stark reminder that we need to address the long-term challenges of rebuilding after these events and ensuring affordable housing in vulnerable communities. Environmental disasters, they often have cascading consequences. We need to be ready.
We've covered a lot. It's almost overwhelming.
It's true. But remember, staying informed is the first step. This is just the beginning. We'll be right back to talk about what you can do to advocate for change and explore some potential solutions.
I know. It can feel like we're just bombarded with bad environmental news.
Yeah, it's true. But even with all that doom and gloom, there are some signs of resistance, signs of resilience. Like, while the Trump administration is rolling back those environmental protections, states, environmental groups, even international actors are pushing back.
So they're not just taking it lying down.
No. The Daily Climate has been reporting on all kinds of legal challenges to these rollbacks.
That's good to hear. And remember that funding freeze on USAID climate programs we were talking about?
Yeah.
Well, the Washington Post actually revealed something kind of unexpected, that freeze, the one that stalled disaster preparedness and clean energy projects in all those countries. It actually has Elon Musk's support.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's crazy, right? It really shows how complicated this whole thing is. You've got this tech innovator who's known for pushing for sustainable technology, but then he's supporting a policy that could hurt a lot of people.
It definitely raises questions about his priorities.
For sure.
Yeah.
It just goes to show how important it is to really look at the information we're getting, especially when it comes to climate change and environmental policy.
Absolutely. We can't just take things at face value. We need to be really careful about what we believe.
Exactly. And while the federal government might be pushing for those fossil fuels, some states are taking a different path. California just debunked a pretty big myth about renewables.
What was that?
Well, Yale Climate Connections reported that the state went a record 98 out of 116 days, providing up to 10 hours of electricity only from renewable sources.
Wow, that's amazing.
Right. It shows that progress is possible, even when things seem really tough.
It's encouraging for sure. And it's not just governments taking action. Individuals and communities are stepping up too. Yale Climate Connections also had a story about some activists who bought a former prison site to rewild the land.
So they're basically turning it back over to nature.
Yeah, their goal is to restore the ecosystem and prevent further exploitation. It's a pretty powerful example of what grassroots movements can accomplish.
It is. It's inspiring to see people doing that.
Mm.
But unfortunately, not every story has a happy ending. The LA Times reported that the monarch butterfly population has dropped to near record lows.
It's really sad. Monarchs are such important pollinators.
Right. They support whole food webs and agriculture.
Exactly. So their decline, it's not just about them. It signals a bigger threat to biodiversity and the balance of nature.
And they're not the only ones struggling. Yale Climate Connections also highlighted the plight of bats. They're so important for pest control, but they're being hit hard by climate change and disease.
It's true. People don't realize how much climate change affects everything. It's not just the rising temperatures and those extreme weather events.
Right. It impacts the whole ecosystem.
Exactly. It changes habitats, disrupts migration patterns, and threatens the survival of so many species.
And then there's the Trump administration's rollback of pollution controls.
Yeah.
The Daily Climate reported that's a huge concern for communities already dealing with industrial pollution.
It's a major environmental justice issue.
Definitely. The people with the fewest resources, they're often the ones who suffer the most. From pollution, from climate impacts, from environmental degradation.
It's not fair. And Inside Climate News shared a story about how Pennsylvania's new energy plan is being criticized as a betrayal to frontline communities.
Because it doesn't do enough to protect them.
Yeah, critics say it prioritizes fossil fuels over clean energy and doesn't really address the needs of the people most affected by pollution.
It's just like we're choosing profits over people.
In a way, it's about who benefits and who pays the price, both environmentally and economically. We need to be demanding better. We need energy policies that work for everyone.
Absolutely. It's clear that staying informed is so important. But awareness alone isn't enough.
Right, we have to turn that knowledge into action.
But with so many issues, it's hard to know where to even start.
Well, remember that even small actions can make a difference. The Daily Climate had a story about how a funding freeze has affected a South Carolina environmental nonprofit. They're struggling to keep going.
So even something like donating to organizations like that can help.
Definitely. Or volunteering, spreading awareness, amplifying their message. It all adds up.
And then there's voting.
Right, don't forget about that. The Daily Climate reported that Big Oil spent a record amount on lobbying last year. It really hurt some key climate measures in California.
So we need to elect officials who actually care about the environment.
Absolutely. But we can also contact our representatives, go to town hall meetings, make our voices heard.
Sometimes it feels like those things don't matter, but they do.
They really do. And sometimes making a difference starts right in our own communities. Reducing our carbon footprint, supporting local environmental initiatives, educating people around us about sustainability.
It's about making those everyday choices.
Exactly, and advocating for bigger changes too. The Associated Press reported that India dropped funding for its climate-friendly lifestyle initiative. It's a reminder that individual actions are important, but we need broader policy changes to really make a difference.
So it's about pushing for systemic solutions.
Right. Addressing the root causes of these problems. We need policies that promote clean energy, sustainable agriculture, responsible consumption.
It's about changing the way we think about things.
Exactly. Recognizing that climate change, pollution, biodiversity loss, they're all symptoms of a system that's focused on the short term.
It's about profits over sustainability.
Exactly. We need to move towards a more just and equitable future.
And it's possible. It can feel overwhelming. But there are people all over the world fighting for that better future.
It's true. And their stories give us hope. They remind us that we're not alone in this fight. We can all be part of the solution.
We can. And we have to. Now, before we wrap things up, I want to share one final story. Okay, I'm intrigued. What is it?
Well, Inside Climate News was reporting on this group of U.S. environmentalists. They actually issued a warning to Japan's prime minister right before his meeting with President Trump.
Really?
Yeah, they were urging him not to make any deals about liquefied natural gas.
LNG.
Right, with the Trump administration. They're saying those agreements could have some pretty bad consequences.
So it's like a trans-Pacific environmental showdown. What's the reason for the warning? Why are they so worried about these potential LNG deals?
Well, they're really concerned about the impacts, environmental and social impacts of producing and exporting LNG. They say expanding the infrastructure for it often hurts the communities that are already dealing with a lot of pollution.
And it keeps us hooked on fossil fuels.
Exactly. It makes it harder to transition to cleaner energy sources.
So it's kind of like a not in my backyard thing, but with global consequences.
Exactly. They're arguing that if the U.S. pushes these LNG exports to Japan, it could actually slow down their transition to renewable.
Which would impact their climate goals.
Right, and their energy policies. And then on top of that, increased demand for LNG could lead to more fracking and gas production here in the U.S.
Which would cause even more environmental damage.
Yeah,
It's crazy how connected everything is.
it really is.
This whole episode has been about the local impacts, global energy markets, climate goals.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how we can even address these challenges when there are so many different interests involved.
Yeah, it's a tough question. It shows how important international cooperation is, transparency too. And we have to recognize that these environmental issues are tied to economic and political considerations.
For sure. Well, this deep dive has definitely been a lot. We've talked about political shakeups, corporate maneuvering, alarming climate trends, and some really inspiring stories of resilience. It feels like we're living in a time of huge change and a lot of uncertainty.
It does.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What can they do to actually make a difference when faced with all these environmental challenges?
I think the most important thing is to stay engaged, stay informed, and stay hopeful. Don't let all the bad news get you down. Choose an issue that you really care about. Learn about it, talk about it, and find ways to take action.
Even small things can make a difference.
They really can. Support organizations, advocate for policy change, make conscious choices in your everyday life.
You don't have to do everything at once.
Nope. Just start small. Find your voice. Connect with other people who share your concerns.
Because together we can create a real movement for change.
Exactly. Every effort counts. Every little bit helps create a healthier and more sustainable future.
So well said. So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for a better world. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.